Which website builder is the most accessible right out of the box? And how do we actually test if a website is accessible? Here's the truth. There is no perfect platform. It highly depends on what matters most to you and your business. And if you choose to value accessibility, and you're either a business owner looking for the best platform to start a website with, or if you are a web designer looking for the best starting point for your project, we tested popular web builders and ranked them in terms of how accessible they are based on their ready-made or native components. This study was actually inspired by our guest expert's presentation on WordPress builder accessibility. Amber Hines is the CEO of Equalized Digital Incorporated, a certified B Corp specializing in WordPress accessibility. She's also the maker of Accessibility Checker plugin and the lead organizer of the WordPress Accessibility Meetup and WP Accessibility Day conference. I believe that website builders should make accessibility easy. And so after watching Amber's analysis of WordPress builders, I knew we also needed to create a similar comparison test for popular platforms like Wix, Webflow, Showit, Shopify, and Squarespace. This is to help business owners and web designers choose platforms that support creating accessible websites. To lessen the variables and to keep our testing fair and focused, we built each page using only native features and ready-made components from each platform. We also followed each platform's best practices and documentation. We also did not make any custom code modifications. Then, Amber individually assessed each platform and calculated its total accessibility score based on applicable criteria specific to that platform. In this video, we'll highlight the results of the study, but Amber conducted thorough tests of each platform based on the criteria, and we have a spreadsheet as a summary. Hence, if you wish to have access to the full report along with the platform-specific accessibility test videos, please refer to the link in the description box below. Why is accessibility important, and does it affect SEO and other web standards?
Accessibility does affect a lot of parts of the website. Of course, the true reason on why accessibility is important is that according to the UN and the CDC in the United States and the World Health Organization, the stat of people with disabilities around the world is around 25%. So about 25% of the population has at least one form of disability, which can impact their ability to use websites if they are not coded and have content entered properly. And what this means then for website owners, particularly if your website is a business site and not just a hobby site, is that you are missing out on potentially 25% more customers who could be learning about your business and submitting your inquiry forms or purchasing your products if you have an e-commerce store. And so accessibility, at a baseline is about ensuring that everybody can use the web and everyone can become a customer of your business or a reader of your web content or consumer of your web content. And accessibility does have broader implications as well. So a lot of SEO and accessibility overlap because they are based on, that technical SEO of having things tagged as headings, having links that have meaning. Well, that's very helpful to a screen reader user. It's also very helpful for Google as they're following links, to understand the content and decide maybe I should tag this a certain way or show it on certain search results. So there is a lot of overlap between accessibility and SEO. Other standards as well, I think, can come into play. There are actual laws around the world that require websites to be accessible, particularly e-commerce websites. But depending upon where you are in the world, the United States, Canada, and the European Union all have laws that require websites to be accessible for people with disabilities if they are business-related websites.
Thank you for that, Amber. Actually, when I started learning about accessibility, I thought it was just another standard like that we need to comply with as a web designer. But then as I learned about it, now my take around it is I'm doing it because of an ethical point of view that I wish to serve as many audience as possible when I create websites. So I really value accessibility. I don't know everything about accessibility, and that's why I value this collaboration of ours. And every day, even when I was looking into the accessibility studies that you did, I learn more about a lot of about accessibility, and I strive hard to keep up with the standards. So yeah, thank you so much for all your guidance and for going through all those accessibility studies. Just a background, this accessibility study was actually inspired by an accessibility study that you did for WordPress builders. And so this is not, I would say, an original original idea of mine. This is based off of yours. So I thought, what if we can also identify the accessibility of popular website builders? Because as an educator in the web design space, what I typically receive from business owners or from aspiring web designers is like, what is the platform that is easy to start with out of the box, that would be easy for us to comply with performance and accessibility standards. So that's the goal of this study. But of course, there were a lot of variables that we need to manage to make sure that we have created a fair baseline for each platform. Before I present the results of the accessibility study, I'd love to hear from your end, like, what are the disclaimers, assumptions, important accessibility considerations that you can share about this study?
I mean, I do want to thank you for reaching out and giving me the opportunity to play around with other builders outside of WordPress space, because I will fully admit that that is one area where I have not done a lot. And I think, to your point, that it's really important that builders make accessibility easy. Whether you're just a web designer just starting out and you're, learning as you go, that's the way I started learning in the beginning. HTML, I would Google stuff, or I would watch videos like the ones that you make, and learn how to build websites. But you even sometimes might have clients who want to do some editing on their website after the fact. And so having a builder or an underlining tool set that you use when you're building websites for your clients that supports accessibility is good, because you might be building this website and potentially handing it off to someone who, they're good at using Microsoft Word, but that's about it, so you want to set them up for success. And the reality, I think, of a lot of web frameworks, unfortunately, is they don't all take accessibility into consideration. Now, when I'm looking at auditing a website or a builder for accessibility, first of all, we don't actually, in that case, if we're looking at how accessible is a tool set, or how much does a tool set someone up for success, we don't actually care what the design looks like. So I don't know if you're going to share screenshots of any of these images for people, or of these websites for people, but they don't look like real websites, right? We're just plopping components in, sticking them in. They have lorem ipsum on them and all of that kind of thing. And there's, for people who are not familiar, there is some accessibility that can come in the content. And
Uh-huh.
there's some accessibility that comes in the code, some of which, depending upon your tool set, you might be able to control, and others of which you absolutely cannot control. So that's something when doing an audit and a study like this and comparing a bunch of builders, trying to separate out what is actually the way that someone entered in the content and what is coming just from the tool itself and having no control. And a good example of this was that it had looked to me like Webflow, there was no page language. And then we found out that there was actually a setting, and when the testing site was set up, that just wasn't filled in. However, it's kind of an interesting question here. So on the report that I put together, I changed it from a fail, because it's not a fail, because you can do it and it will have a page language in the HTML. However, I still mark it as a concern because that's a setting that's sort of buried and it doesn't do it by default. Whereas there are some other builders who just recognize that you've chosen, you want to make your website in English. So therefore the website language is English, right? And they're just automatically doing that work for you. And so that's a really great example of, you can build something that has accessible page language in Webflow, but you have to know to do that. And many people might not know to do that. But if you have an alternative builder like Squarespace or Shopify, maybe that is, or WordPress is one where it just automatically sets that based on the language that you're using in the editor, then that kind of takes it out of your hands and does the work for you. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to think about when I'm assessing these is, what can the user control, but in what areas are maybe certain builders stepping up and guiding users a little bit more?
Yeah, that's a great insight. And that's what I also found when I was looking into this different web builders. They have, like, I would say, different initial state, or like in the case of Webflow, they would say they're not a drag and drop builder, but more of a visual code editor. It's great that they have these options, but if I am such a new user of the platform, it would be best if, at the very least, I would be guided. Like if there are prompts or labels guiding me through what are the essential steps to make sure that we have at least an accessible baseline to start with. There are platforms such as Squarespace and Shopify who just have these settings by default, which is great. Actually, most of them, and then Wellflow just gives us more freedom in terms of setting it up or not. In terms of the study that we did, we tried as much as possible to also observe the best practices based on their documentation. So Webflow is such a flexible, robust platform. And there are components which we will get into later, like carousels and accordions, wherein they have documentation on how to make them accessible, probably add some codes or set up some configurations. But I found, like in search of those documentation, that they are not as straightforward. And so when we build out those test websites, I did not follow those documentation because there were not enough information.
And you're a technical person.
Yes, I'm
right?
a technical person.
Imagine if a non-technical person was coming trying to build this.
Yes. And I've had experience with a lot of other platforms. And what I did actually was I also consulted with another Webflow expert, another Wix expert, because while I've used these platforms for a while, they also continuously improve their platform. So I wanted to be up to date on what are the available options. So those are the considerations. Of course, it's impossible for us to remove all the variables such that we can rank them, but by just looking, because when we did this study, I intentionally didn't want to give you immediate access to the editor because I wanted to see how it looks like just from a user point of view, like when you're using a screen reader. So I would love for you to just give overall impression on those platforms with regard to accessibility, just from like going through the test sites.
Sure. So I'll say the other thing you had asked me before about disclaimers. So what I think is always good for everyone who's watching this to be aware is this wasn't a comprehensive accessibility audit. We didn't test every template you could choose for one of these things. We didn't test every possible component. We only looked at specific types of components. So what the approach was we looked at the header, and specifically on the header, we're looking at the skip link, whether there is a skip link that allows a keyboard only user to bypass the navigation and quickly get to the content. Does it actually function? We looked at the navigation. Does the navigation have all of the expected keyboard functionality? Does it work for low vision users on Zoom, screen reader users? Does a mobile navigation menu work? Does it follow like the expected tabbing interaction, all of that sort of stuff? And then for content within the site, we looked at sort of a common layout that you see where there's an image and a heading or some text and maybe a link or a link styled as a button. We looked at embedded videos and the accessibility of those, whether they were hosted on the platform, hosted on YouTube. We looked at autoplay videos, which is super common, but I'll put a thing out there. Don't do it. We looked at accordions and carousels and contact forms, but we didn't look at like tabs. We didn't look at maybe some really complex other layouts that might exist in these builders. So my disclaimer is, this is a snapshot. I think it's a really good snapshot. We had all of these components laid out on websites with fake filler content. I wasn't paying any attention to design. There were a few places where I flagged color contrast as a potential thing to look at, but in a lot of places I sort of ignore it because for the most part, I'm going to assume that users can control that. But, there were some places where color contrast was assessed and looked at. And then basically I used my tab key to move through the whole website, make sure I could do that. I also used VoiceOver screen reader, and I looked at a few things with NVDA screen reader as well, which is a Windows screen reader. VoiceOver is on Mac, to just sort of compare them if I needed to double check something I heard in VoiceOver with NVDA. So how I'm calculating like how they all compare to each other is I take, for everything, they could either get a pass, a fail, or a concern, or like a not applicable. If something didn't exist, then I wasn't going to rank it either way. So I took like the total of applicable things, and then I calculated what percentage actually passed. So that way it's fair because it's based on how many were applicable. I don't want to just total up the most passed because that's not a true judge, right?
I know we have a lot of criteria, and we'll show our audience like via the spreadsheet and charts that we'll create based off of this spreadsheet. Like there are several criteria per main component that we looked into. But based on like the critical ones, or just overall, which do you think, which platform do you think had accessibility in mind when they built this native component?
What I would say is the top two, it's sort of a tie, I think, to a degree, without like really diving in, and we can talk about that a little more, between Squarespace and Shopify. So I think it makes sense that Shopify is putting a lot of effort into accessibility because a lot of the laws, like the European Accessibility Act that is going into enforcement in June of 2025, it's very focused on e-commerce. So it really makes sense that Shopify is doing that. And it doesn't, it didn't surprise me to see that they were one of the better platforms. There was a little bit on forms that I thought could have been better on Shopify, related to like error descriptiveness. errors being announced or success messages being announced by screen readers. So I would, love to see that. And I would say for sure, if you have a checkout form on a Shopify website, you should investigate that. Squarespace, though, did very well on that front. I was impressed with both of them. Had really good accordions. Their carousels were pretty good. There was a little bit on the Squarespace carousel where the screen readers were reading some hidden items, which isn't great. You should never hear anything that isn't actually visible, or if you get to it by tabbing, then it should become visible. So there was a little bit there on Squarespace. The other thing was a few issues related to Zoom, or a few instances with maybe some missing focus indicators on Squarespace. Then Webflow sort of came in as my number 3, but it's so close to Wix, which is number 4. So it's like Squarespace, Shopify, then we've got Webflow and Wix. And then down at the very bottom, it was like no contest. Showit was the absolute worst. And
Yes.
and I'll be totally honest, I'd never heard of Showit before this.
Oh, it's such a popular platform.
Is it really?
In our space, maybe like if you're a service provider, it's either Squarespace or
Yeah.
Showit, like in our space, because we're starting out as web designers. We're coming from design and venturing into web design. Our top 2 choices would be either Squarespace or Showit.
The biggest one that just shocked me the most, I've never seen anywhere on Showit, was related to the navigation and the fact that like the keyboard order was all over the place. So normally when you're tabbing through something, you expect to go left to right. And then if there's a drop down menu, you would go across, go down a drop down menu, then go back up to the next item, then go down that drop down menu, right? Like in order. But it was all backwards in Showit. So you went like from the logo over to the right side of the navigation menu, going back towards the left. And then if there was a drop down, you would have to open the drop down, but then the drop down wouldn't be next in the tab order. So you'd have to tab past other things, and then it would get you into the drop down. And I was just like, this is so bad. And the thing is on a website like that, especially a problem with the navigation menu, people are just going to leave. They're not going to try and fight it, like that's the kind of thing where unless they have a legitimate, real, like, this is the restaurant that I am going to, and the reservations were already made by somebody else, and I just need to like call them and make sure that it works for my allergies. And so therefore I'm going to work really hard to find the phone, right? Like if they've just Googled something and your website has come up as a possible solution to what they've Googled, if they encounter a problem like that, they're going to be like, no. And they'll go back to Google and they'll go to result number 2, and that kind of thing. It's just, it's a major problem. And so I was definitely not impressed with Showit.
I was wondering though, like, are there tools which can help users of Showit to improve their accessibility? I mean, there are tools for website accessibility that might claim that they can remediate what the platform is lacking, or do you think these can only be addressed by the platform?
So the tools that you're talking about are what are commonly called accessibility overlays. These are things like
Yes.
Accessibility or User Way or Equal Access. People may have seen them on a website. They add like a little icon. You can click it. It opens up this giant toolbar with all these options, like change the color contrast, make the font size larger, those
Yeah,
kinds of things.
that's it.
Yeah, I never recommend using an overlay. I will say I have seen some instances where overlays have improved some things. Like, for example, I came across a WordPress website where none of the drop downs would open for keyboard, and the owner installed one of these overlays, and now they would actually open for keyboard. But I have also seen a lot of instances where they can add problems. We are working on remediating a website right now that had user way on it. And if you toggled the make font size bigger, it didn't actually change any of the containers. So what happened was all the text just like overlapped one another and wasn't readable. So these tools really need a lot of testing if you think you're going to use one. I always advise people to look at, there's a website called the Overlay Fact Sheet that has a
Uh-huh.
lot of information about overlays and is a really good resource. The thing that really gives me pause from recommending them is the fact that a lot of people with disabilities do not like overlays,
Mm.
particularly people who are blind, because they say that sometimes if an overlay recognizes that they're using a screen reader, it will modify the website in a way that is not helpful and sometimes is a blocker for them.
Mm.
These tools are also expensive. They on the low end are like $50 a month, and sometimes
Yeah,
they charge
$50 a month.
much more than that based on page views. So in my mind, it's so much better to invest some amount of money in doing an initial fix on the website, which is going to last forever, and not have a monthly, you have to pay for this all the time without even knowing. And I don't recommend them. I think it's better to put some effort in and, if you can report things to the platform, if you have a Showit website, if you're not able, or you bring in a developer who's really good at Showit and they're like, no, this is really just a Showit problem, there's nothing that we can do, I would go to Showit first and try and advocate, because if you can do that, then maybe Showit will fix it and will fix everyone's website. But bottom line, sometimes if you're in a particular builder, and this is the same thing with my page builder report, and in WordPress, like Divi is one that's really popular that is very bad at accessibility, and they as a company have literally said they don't care. So the
Oh,
reality is sometimes you just have to change your tool.
uh-huh. That might be the best option. And I would have to add
Mhm.
that there are those like Squarespace wherein if for example, they improve something, they can push all the updates across all sites. But there
Mhm.
are also like theme-based platforms like Shopify, wherein it would be dependent on the theme that we used. Like
Mhm.
in the study, we particularly used the the most recent Dawn theme, which is the default theme of Shopify. So there are a lot of other themes on Shopify. So this study does not apply to other themes. This is why Shopify actually advocates using their Dawn theme, the default theme, as the base for other themes because they've really looked into the accessibility. One thing, though, is when you start with a theme, and for example, they have an update, you have to update your themes file before that accessibility update will be applied. So it's not like Squarespace or Webflow wherein they can push updates across all sites. Yeah, for Shopify, it might not work that way, but I'm pretty sure for Showit, if they improve their tooling, then that can be pushed across all sites that are using Showit. So, yeah, hopefully it would not be the case like Divi, wherein they simply did not care. Hopefully, this reaches the Showit community and start paying attention to accessibility. I would love to hear if like there are critical accessibility criteria that you're looking into. When I was starting out auditing sites for accessibility, like one of the things that I look into is whether the outline, the visible focus outline is present, because there are times wherein I tab through and there isn't anything that's showing up, and it's probably CSS or JavaScript that's interfering it. Is it one of the accessible, like the more critical accessibility criteria that you're looking at, or if there are other ones?
Yeah, so the accessibility criteria is so interesting because different types of disabilities rely on different types of accessibility features, is maybe the best way to put that, more than others, right? So the focus outline as you're tabbing through is incredibly important for someone who can see but has mobility challenges and therefore relies on a keyboard or an alternative input device instead of a mouse. So they're not using a mouse, but they can see. And that outline is really important to them. A screen reader user could care less if that outline is there, because I mean, now some screen reader users are sighted, but many of them are blind or have very low vision, and they wouldn't be able to see that outline anyway. You know, sort of like captions on videos being a lot for people who are deaf, or, you know, if you're on a train and you forgot your headset and you want to watch something, you might use the captions, right? I mean, I think especially on social media these days, we like scroll through and half the time we don't turn the sound for the video on at all. We just read what it says, right? But at the same time, there's other people that, you know, like people who are deaf and rely on captions, that might be the only assistive feature that they actually need on a website. And otherwise they engage with it like a typical user might, with a mouse and a keyboard and using, you know, average sort of navigation. So it's kind of hard to say like what is the most important, but I will say like keyboard navigation, having it follow and be able to get to everything. So like actually being able to go to buttons and links and click on them, being able to get to all of the form fields and having it follow the right order, that impacts a lot of people. It impacts sighted keyboard users. It impacts blind people. It impacts people who use alternative input devices. So that has wide reach. Heading levels. This is one that, again, we didn't really assess this that much because that's usually a user input, but this is something that almost every theme, whether it's a Squarespace theme or a Shopify theme or a WordPress theme, a lot of them get this wrong. Like sometimes people think I just choose the number, like it's an H2 or an H3 or an H4 based upon how big I want it to be or what color I want it to be. But really the headings need to be in, if you think back to school and you had to write an outline, and they need to follow an outline format that makes sense on the page, and you use headings to structure content. And so that's something that really has very broad reach for a lot of people, including many people who might not even consider themselves to be disabled. So, and you know, we talked about captions, right? Like that's really important and sometimes also used by people who don't consider themselves to be disabled. I would say if you're just getting into this as a web designer and you're trying to figure out where to start, what I always recommend is making sure that the navigation can be used with just a keyboard. Even if you don't, try a screen reader. If you have a Mac, you have VoiceOver on already. If you have Windows, you can download NVDA for free. Try it for sure. But even if you don't try that in the beginning, if you're just like using the tab key, making sure you can, you know, take your mouse, turn it off, put it in a drawer, do everything on the website that you would want a customer of that website to do. And then having your headings in the right order, making sure your links are really meaningful. So for example, using the text learn more, not very helpful, because a blind person might use to navigate. A lot of times they just use lists of links in their screen reader. It will say, here's all the links on a page. Well, if you've got link, learn more, link, learn more, link, learn more about what? Right? So trying to really have meaningful text. Another one is even just in paragraphs. Sometimes people will say to do blah, 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 click here, and they only link the word here. Instead, just rewrite that sentence that says, you know, do blah, 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 and link that phrase, right? Whatever that might be. So I think that's good. And really like thinking about like the motion. There were some things that we looked at in the study, like if a video is on autoplay, is there a pause button, or does it respect if I were to turn on the setting in my computer to prefers reduced motion and it just doesn't play? Again, that one is on the platform more than a builder building with that platform. But if you do put an autoplay in and it has the option to put a pause button, use the pause button, because that might be really helpful for someone who has motion sensitivity. And that's not just for videos, it's also for carousels. So if you have some sort of carousel that auto slides, there needs to be a pause button. And if the pause button doesn't exist in the platform that you're building with, then the solution is don't use autoplay.
Yeah.
Right. And you can still
Yes.
maybe have a carousel with the buttons. It just doesn't need to swipe through.
And yeah, and to that point, there are also these platforms also offer like built-in animations. Like when you scroll, something animates. I believe for accessibility, there should be a way to turn those animations off if in their device they choose to reduce the motion. We did not look into that, but again, some of these platforms have those built-in options.
That is one thing that as a web designer could easily be solved for by just not using the animation.
Yes.
And you know, talking back, like how does accessibility overlap with other things? Well, performance. All of those animations and things, when you add them in, it adds JavaScript code that the more JavaScript code you have, potentially the slower the website could be. So
Yes.
not having those things can help with that. And I'll tell you personally, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but where you're on your phone somewhere, not on Wi-Fi, on just a mobile connection, and you're trying to look something up on a website and you go to it and you're trying to scroll on the website and like all the stuff has this 3-second fade up animation. And it's so frustrating. You're like, I just want to, like, I don't want to sit here and wait for your content to load. You know, like I just want it to
the
be
information
there. And these like fade up or fly in or like fade in animations, all they do is actually give us the perspective that the website is slower. It may not be, but that's what it looks like, right? Because the way we all are mentally is we want instant. You know, we have a website on our phone. We want it to like open and everything is there. And so for me, like the websites that we build at my company, we don't ever put any animation on them. A few clients fight back on that. Like when we explain it that way, they're like, oh yeah, that is kind of a good point. Like, I don't want to be annoying. I want to work on mobile without Wi-Fi. Like, and it's good for people with disabilities. It's good for everyone else. So
yes, and it would be much simpler to build as well.
Less work for you, right?
Yes, for like more of a win-win approach. And it's also probably a learning opportunity as well for clients because sometimes they see all of these other websites and they see all these animations. It could be just for us to educate them how this will affect the build out process as well as the user experience.
You know, when I'm talking to clients about that kind of stuff, I like to try and find enterprise or larger companies that are in their same industry. Because while it is very common for, you know, like template based builds to have a lot of animations in them, if you go look at apple.com, Microsoft.com or whatever it might be, or like if they're a doctor's office, maybe you go look at the hospital system website, right? Or you know, if they're e-commerce, well, go look at target.com or whatever it might be, right? And sort of you can show them there like, well, they don't do this. So while it might be common that like, you know, the smaller websites like to do it a lot, and so I think if you work on it, you can sort of find good examples. Like having underlines on links is really important instead of only a color, because if someone is colorblind, they might not be able to differentiate that it is linked, and so they need that underline to show them that there's a link there. And sometimes we'll get pushback on that, but then I'll usually just go find, I'm like, you know, I have a list of different websites and I'm like, do it really well. And I'll be like, well, look at this brand. And then they'll usually be like, oh, okay, well, if they, you know, the New York Times can underline their links, I guess I can too.
I really noticed that for more established brands, they're like much more paying attention in terms of accessibility. And so I think giving these as examples and how established brands do it hopefully would convince clients too. But I think that's such a great idea. You've mentioned the main components that we've looked into. Um, if you could just briefly go through like the important things that we've looked into and how important they are in terms of accessibility.
All right. So when you first visit a website, you want to see that if you hit tab, it pops up a link that you wouldn't normally see. So mine says skip to main content. You might just see skip to content. So this is a skip link. What it does is it allows people to not have to tab through. You can see I've got a lot of items in my navigation menu and multiple drop downs. If every time that a page loads as they're going through my website, I don't want to force a keyboard user to have to go through those. We want to allow them to just jump right to the main area. So we have the skip link, and then if we were to hit return on it, then it jumps to that area. And now you can see I'm down below. So I'm on the get started button. I'm on the browse our services button. So we're looking for a skip link, and did it work? And really that's just to make it faster and allow people to skip this repeated content in the header and get to the content faster if they are a keyboard only user. And then on the navigation, we looked for a lot of things. So let me go up here. There's some code, and I won't go too much into that now, but I'll say also on the videos from the audits, you see me going through them and doing some inspection just to see, are things actually labeled? So, and using the right HTML elements. So for example, a navigation menu needs to use a nav tag, and it says this is the primary menu. So we know this is different from like a secondary menu that might exist, or a footer menu. So looking at, does it have the underlying semantics? A key thing on nav menus that are really important is you don't want to necessarily force people to go into the drop downs. So we have the ability to go across, and then there's buttons that can open and close. I'm just hitting the return key, but I could also use my space bar. That's my space bar. And I could go into the menu then. This is especially helpful if you're building one of those websites with a mega menu.
Yes.
And let's say there's 4 columns in every dropdown. You don't want to force someone to have to tab through every column in every mega menu just because they want to get to events that's over here. That's maybe the 5th item in the menu. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at. Another thing too, when you're testing, and this is easy, anyone can do this test, is you want to make sure that the website is properly responsive for people who are low vision. So in this case, I just zoomed into 200%. We'll check at 200%. We check at 400%. So knowing that I can still use my tab key, I can open and close the navigation menu and the sub items. You can see that. And that it still works, because there may be people who are visiting the website. And a lot of people say, well, why does the mobile menu need to be accessible? Well, blind people use phones, but also this view of the website that's mobile might be how people are viewing it on a desktop computer if they have low vision. So those are kind of things that we look for on the navigation menu. The image with text, basically we're looking, was it easy to set an alternative text on an image? Looked at, if there were any links here, did they get a keyboard focus? Was it clear when they were being focused on? Same sort of thing. Did they work on Zoom? Didn't overlap. Most of them did. I think Wix had an issue where if we zoomed in 400%, the text was kind of overlapping with the image in a weird way that made it hard to read at certain screen widths. And this is sort of like basic, that Zoom is very much like a basic mobile responsive testing, so you zoom in, you also change your browser size a bunch, make sure that it works for everybody on all devices at all widths. So for accordions, what we're looking at here is we want to be able to tab to it. So you can see that I've tabbed, there's that visible focus outline, open with the return key or the button, or the space bar. So it should open with either one. I'm going to inspect this real quick. So they're using a details and summary, which is not my favorite tag for this. It's okay as long as there can also be a heading, and you can see
Oh,
they have figured out how to put a heading. There's a heading 3, which is correct because we'd want like a heading 2, and this is a sub item of that. So this works out, that they've figured out a way to get it in there. The other way to do this would be to have a heading with a button inside it.
mm-hmm.
So there'd be, rather than using the details and summary tag.
Uh-huh.
But this worked pretty well. And the carousel was also pretty good as far as keyboard functionality.
Uh-huh.
Let's see where I am right now. So one thing I don't love, I didn't write them off for this, but I find it a little weird on this website that every time I start tabbing, it takes me back to the top.
Uh-huh.
I'd want to investigate that and figure out why you can't start in the middle of the page. Normally on other websites, I can like highlight something and then it will make it start
Ah,
there.
yeah.
But do you
I
notice
think
now
that's
I hit
also the
tab and I'm back at the
case
top?
with Squarespace when you were testing it. It somehow goes back to the
It kept
top.
jumping me back to the
Yeah.
top. Yeah. But anyway, so like just looking at, that's me hitting the space bar. Can I go
Yeah, because
through
I see a lot of
them?
sites wherein in the carousels,
Mhm.
we cannot navigate it via the tab key. But in this particular example, Shopify has
Mhm.
that as well as like most of them. Yeah,
Yeah.
Squarespace also particularly has this option to tab through the slides.
So the one thing that Shopify was the only one who passed this, which is that when using the navigation buttons, the focus would actually shift to the slide. So I showed that in my
Oh,
audit,
yes.
which is that when I have a screen reader turned on, if I click one of these previous or next buttons, I don't want it to just change the slide and not say anything. What I want it to do is change the slide and then move the focus so then it actually reads the content in the slide. Because
Mm,
so Shopify did that. They were the only one. Well, no, actually, Wix did that too.
uh-huh.
So Shopify and Wix did that, but
Mm-hmm.
everyone else didn't. So what happens for the other ones, if the carousel doesn't do that, is you hit previous, it changes the slide. And then you'd have to go like backwards. You do shift tab to go backwards or use your
Mm-hmm.
arrow key to try and find the content. So what's much better for someone who is not sighted is they hit previous and then it just starts to read, or they hit next, whichever one, and then it just starts reading them the content that has become visible. They don't have to
Oh,
go look for
yeah.
it and try and figure out where it is.
Oh, it's
So
similar to
Shopify
the
did that.
uh-huh. It's similar to the requirement for tabs, like a tabbed menu, wherein
Mm-hmm.
would be you should like the visible content should have the focus.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yes.
So oh yeah, that's a great observation. I believe most forms gives us control platforms gives us control over the placeholder text. Do you mind sharing more about the requirements for
Yeah.
forms?
So I'll go back to our website just because I think, we have a really good example of forms. So first of all, placeholder text is not good. You almost never want to use it. You want to have
Mm,
visible labels above instead of placeholder text. Placeholder text can cause a lot of confusion for screen reader users. By default, it fails color contrast. Like there's just a lot of reasons not to use placeholder text. And a lot of people misuse it. Like even on this example here, although this isn't, it looks like placeholder text, but it's actually, that's the label. It's just been
yes.
designed that way, right? So there are ways where you can design it and make it look nicer if you want to make it look like placeholder text, but you don't want to use that. And then looking at, are fields actually programmatically required? Are there things like, again, there's some inspecting of the code, but for example, this input has an autocomplete on it that says given name.
Mm,
And then that's the first name field. And then, my last name field is has family name on it. And And then again, like job title, company name, email, phone number, all of these things have an autocomplete attribute. So looking to see if those exist, that's what allows your browser, when you go into it, to just fill in the whole form for you magically,
Oh,
right? Having that attribute, which a lot of us use all the time. Credit card
yes.
fields on a checkout
Uh-huh.
form, if it has the autocomplete attribute and someone has saved their credit card in their browser, right, then it will just fill it in for them, which is very helpful for people with disabilities. But again, one of those things that a lot of us typically abled people also appreciate. And then we want to know, so I'll do things like I won't fill out the form at all, and I'll just hit the submit button.
Uh-huh.
And
Oh.
doing that with a screen reader, I want to hear, does the screen reader tell me there was an error? Because if it's only visual on the page, that's not very helpful for someone who's blind. Also looking for, is there a summary up at the top that says everything that was missed? And, even better is these are links, and you could click one and it would jump you down to that section, right? So you could be right there. Theoretically, they wouldn't miss every field.
Yes.
But it helps them get back to where the problem is, making sure that there's descriptive errors, that, makes it clear what's going on. Like if it's an email address and they missed an @ symbol, it would say something like missed an @ symbol. In this example, I haven't typed anything, so it's just telling you it's required, you need to type it, but it would change. So looking at those sorts of things. And then the same thing, once you submit it, can you hear the success message? And do you know, hey, it actually worked, even if you cannot see? So those are sort of things that we're looking for. So like this is a field set with a legend. So making sure that any fields that are grouped were grouped appropriately. I actually ended up adding for Wix, because Wix weirdly put every field, like the entire form was in a field set, which makes no sense. And there wasn't the legend. So I was like, that was a check I don't normally look for, but I saw it on Wix. And so I ended up being like, now I'm going to check for that on all
And
of
just
them.
imagine, like,
Yeah.
a lot of us are really reliant on these like built-in options in these platforms. And so I mean, they claim to be drag and drop. And so it's hard for us to actually edit the HTML, their built-in HTML. So like really knowing what the requirements are really helpful. So what do you think are the best learning resources for business owners and website designers like me who would like to learn more about accessibility standards, and if there are tools and resources that you could recommend?
Sure. So I'll give a little pitch, which is that I run a twice a month meetup on Zoom. It's called WordPress Accessibility Meetup, but it's not all WordPress specific. There is a lot that applies to everyone, and it's the first Thursday and the third Monday at different times, so they hit different parts of the world. So we have something that's sort of in the morning for the US and something that's in the morning for Australia. And
that's so inclusive.
Yes, if you go to equalizedigital.com/meetup, you can see what's coming up, but also we record and just publish publicly all of the videos from all of those. So I would highly recommend that. And again, a lot of them are platform agnostic. They're just accessibility in general.
I would be so looking forward to that, because I was looking into your accessibility study for each of the platform, and I was blown away, like how much I learned just looking at how you look into the sites. And the reason why I reached out to you is because I noticed that all of those are really applicable to any platform, even though when you published the study for WordPress builders, it was towards a WordPress audience. But I look into how you were explaining it and how you were going through all the sites, and I thought, oh, all platforms would benefit from all your insights. So I will definitely put that in the link in the description below in our blog post, equalizedigital.com/meetup.
Yeah. Another resource that I would recommend is the Ally Collective, which is A11Y Collective.
Mm.
They have courses, like e-courses that you can take that are not builder specific at all. They're just on general accessibility, and they have some for design, some for content, some for development. So they are a really great resource, learning resource. It's kind of dense, but reading the web content accessibility guidelines is truly the best way to learn. Those are the international agreed upon standards that most laws reference it. Most laws reference, and really going through those, even if it takes time, but reading through them, each success criterion has a link to a understanding document, so you can go and it will explain why are we doing this success criterion, what's the goal of it, why does it matter, what are examples of passes, what are examples of fails. So maybe like taking bite-sized chunks of that and going through and saying, okay, I'm just going to read the stuff related to videos, and work through that. And that's the general way that I would advise approaching any sort of learning accessibility or accessibility remediation, which is like choosing specific things to focus on, work on improving those, and then you can do the next thing. There are some really great free tools out there. Of course, if anyone's building WordPress websites, we make a plugin called Accessibility Checker that can be used to audit WordPress websites. If you don't use WordPress and you're building with one of these other content management systems, there is a browser extension called Wave that comes from WebAIM. That is a free browser extension that will do some audits and help you find some problems. There's a few browser extensions I really like. Another one is called Headings Map, all one word together, and they have both a Firefox and a Chrome browser extension, and it just outlines for you all the headings on the page. Which is super great if you're trying to check, like, did I use the right ones in the right order? Did I not skip any? Is there actually an H1 on this page, which is really important. Tably is another browser extension. There's one called Landmark Navigation that will highlight for you all the HTML landmark regions and whether or not they're named. We have a Facebook group, WordPress Accessibility Facebook group. But again, we have people in there who sometimes ask questions, where most people are going to be about answering how to fix them in WordPress, but there is general accessibility there as well.
Oh, that's so helpful to know. I personally just used so far the Google Lighthouse, the accessibility, and so I'll definitely look into all the other tools in terms of services, because some of us really work on websites. Like, of course, there are a lot of things that we look into, responsiveness, and most of the time really just need help, like probably remediating some of accessibility issues or just letting us know what the issues are, and then we can address them via code. Do you offer any audit services or any sorts of services that we can like avail as website designers or business owners, just so we are aware of how we can improve our site or the site that we build for clients?
Yeah, we do accessibility audits that are one-off, just sort of per page. We can do a micro audit just of one page or several pages. We also do user testing. We have people who are blind and visually impaired, and some people who have cognitive disabilities, if that's an audience that the website serves. So we can do tests. Those are actually really fun because we get on Zoom and you have the ability, if you want to also join in on Zoom, and we run through tasks or scenarios with people where we just say, okay, assume you want to do this. What would you do? And then they're like on the homepage and you get to see, like, would they use the navigation? Would they use the search feature? How does it function for them with their screen reader? So, and then you get a written report after the fact and the recording of the video, which is super fun. And then I do incidental consulting as well. So if people want consulting or just, an hour of, hey, here are the questions I have, can you just answer them? Do that as well.
That's so interesting, because I found that, we've talked about accessibility overlays and some of them like do AI generated alt text or so. And it's just so refreshing to hear that you actually consult those users, the actual users that we care about, what they think about the site, because, other accessibility tools, somehow they give an impression that once we install their tool, we're already covered. But in fact, there's a lot into the process that goes into it. So I really appreciate that you consult these users about their thoughts about the site. That's so thoughtful. And I believe the more effective way to approach it.
It is really important to include people with disabilities. The way that even as an expert tester who's been testing websites for years, the way I use a screen reader is not the way a typical user who uses a screen reader every day is going to use a screen reader. So I really do think it's important to include users with disabilities. You just have to figure out when the right time in the process is. I always recommend start with automated testing. So whether you're using the Wave browser extension or you're using Lighthouse, I don't think Lighthouse is as thorough. I would go to Wave. Or there's one called Axe that DQ puts out, or using our WordPress plugin. Do that, fix all of those problems first, and then do your manual review and testing. And again, like you can do a lot of this even without bringing in a consultant. If you do some initial like tabbing through, can you get to it? And then having accessibility specialists, you want to try and get as many problems that are really quote obvious fixed before you bring in a user. Otherwise you get hung up on them saying like, this image has no alt text. This image has no alt text. This image, right? It's like, well, I don't really need to pay you to tell me that. So that's what I would recommend is like starting with automated testing, manual testing, and then bringing in users. Users I like to think of as like proving accessibility, or also being ways like they give us general usability feedback. Like sometimes we've learned that the word that a business wanted to put for a page in their navigation isn't a word that any user would think to click on to go find that specific thing. Right. So you get interesting feedback like that from users as well.
Amber, this has been such a wealth of insight in terms of accessibility. So I really thank you. And I look forward to so many more collaborations because we'd love to work with you more on making all platforms accessible. So
that would be great. I would love
yes.
That.
I highly recommend checking out the full accessibility report via the link in the description below. The report contains the individual accessibility test videos per platform and the summary of the findings, as well as the accessibility audit matrix that Amber created. And there's a lot of learning opportunity just by watching Amber conduct the accessibility tests. And of course, if you found this study and video helpful, please don't forget to subscribe and share this resource with other business owners and website designers.